In this video, I wanted to give you a few tips and tricks to help you when factoring quadratic trinomials. So if you recall, when factoring quadratic trinomials like these, what we need to try and do is take the middle term and split it so that we can have it as a 4-term polynomial and factor by grouping. That was at least the method that we used initially. I want to show you a new technique that only works in this form. So you can see these all have something in common. All of them have a leading coefficient of 1. All of them have a coefficient of 1 for their first term. And if that happens, we actually are able to skip the whole factoring by grouping process, and we can actually jump straight into our two groups. So there's a couple things that we want to pay attention to. And first of all, you want to pay attention to the variable. So if your leading coefficient is 1, we're always going to have whatever our variable is in the first term, because if you multiply x times x, you'll get your x squared like that. Now, the next thing that we need to do is pay attention to the signs. So if the back sign is positive, that means that the two signs that we have in our binomial in here will be the same. So if the back sign is positive, that means we're either going to have two positive numbers, right? So we'll either have a plus and a plus, or we'll have a minus and a minus. And that depends on this middle sign. So if this sign is positive, that tells us we have a plus and a plus. If it was negative, we would have a minus and a minus. So in this situation, we're going to have something like x minus and x minus. So now we have to figure out what the other two numbers are, what goes here and what goes here. So we're going to deal with this one first. So if you remember, when doing factoring, we were looking for numbers that multiplied to be, in this case, it would be 1 times 28. So it'd just be 28. So multiplying to be 28 and adding to be 11. So what are two numbers that multiply to 28 and add to 11? Well, 28 has factors of 1 and 28. 2 and 14, 3 doesn't go into it, 4 and 7, and that's it. And 4 and 7 works, so it's going to be x plus 4 and x plus 7. So that would be that one factored. So let's go ahead and take a look at this one. So again, we said, looking at the back sign, first of all, looking at the leading coefficient, it's 1. Looking at the back sign is positive. So then you look at this, the middle sign, since it's negative. Well, the positive back sign means that we're going to have the same sign. And then since the middle sign is negative, it's going to be 2 minuses. So what are two numbers that multiply to 14 but add to -9? So we're looking for factors of 14. So we have 1 and 14. 2 and 7, and that's about it. And actually these are going to be negative. So which of those sum to -9? So it's going to be these two. So it's x minus 2 and x minus 7. Okay. Now what happens if the two signs are different? So again, we have a leading coefficient of 1. In this situation, we have a negative back sign. So if the sign in the back is negative, what that tells me is we're going to get 1 plus and 1 minus. Since the leading coefficient's 1, we can just jump straight to this. So it's going to be r and r. And so now we have to figure out factors of 30, where 1 is positive, 1 is negative, that add to -7. So what are the factors of 30? So we have 1 and 30, 2 and 15, 3 and 10, 4 doesn't go into it, 5 and 6. Now, since the middle term is negative, that means the larger number is going to be negative. Because remember, if you think about this, right, we're looking to multiply to -30 and add to -7. So that means that we're looking for 1 positive and 1 negative, and it has to be, the larger number has to be negative because we're trying to add to that. So which of these sum to -7? Well, that sums to be -29, -13, -7. So the 3 is positive, so it's going to be r plus 3, and the 10 is negative, so it'd be r minus 10. So then what would this one look like? Back sign's negative, so again, 1 positive, 1 negative. Now this positive and negative, like the signs also work when the leading coefficient isn't 1, so you can always see that. So if the back sign is positive, that means it has the same sign. If the back sign is negative, that means they have opposite signs. Since the leading coefficient is 1, that means we're going to be able to jump straight to this, and we're going to have a p and a p. So again, we're looking for factors of 26 that add to be 11. So if we think in this, right, so it's 1 times negative 26 is negative 26, and then positive 11, so we have 1 plus 1 minus. This means that the bigger number is going to have to be positive because we get a positive sum in the end. So 1 and 26, 2 and 13, 3 doesn't go into it, 4 doesn't go into it. That's actually it. And the larger number is positive. This is actually a negative 26. So those are our factors. So I think it's going to be negative 2 and positive 13. So it's going to be p plus 13 and p minus 2. So that's how you would, that's a little trick that we can do. And we can actually jump straight into our two binomial groups only when the leading coefficient's 1. So I want to really, really stress this. This only works this way when the leading coefficient is 1. If we have a situation like we have here, where now we have a leading coefficient of something other than 1, we cannot just jump straight to this. We cannot jump straight to this. We have to do the little bit of extra work that we did before. However, what we do know about our two groups, since the back term is positive, that means that we're going to have the same signs in here. So the back term is positive, the middle term is negative, so that means we're going to have two negatives. So how would you approach this? Well, again, take the two terms, take their product, right? So take the leading coefficient and take your constant and multiply them. And remember that goes on top. And then the middle term goes on bottom. And you look for factors of 6 that add to negative 7. We know that they're both going to be negative. So 6 is 1 and 6, 2 and 3. They'll both be negative. So it's going to be negative 1 and negative 6. So we actually can't put this here just yet. So we're going to take this, all of this, and rewrite it. So let me do this. So it's 3y squared. Remember, that's the splitting this middle term. So it's going to be minus y minus 6y plus 2. Then you would go through the process of splitting your middle term, or splitting your two things, factoring by grouping. So you would go through that whole process. But in the end, our result is going to look something like this, where it's going to have a minus and a minus. Okay. Now, this one is interesting. Negative 5x squared minus 8x plus 4. Now, the thing that makes it really interesting, well, first of all, it doesn't have a leading coefficient of 1. But the thing that makes it even more interesting is that the leading coefficient's negative. So this negative leading coefficient actually can cause some problems. So the first thing that we want to do is we actually want to take out a negative. So we're going to treat that negative as if it was a GCF, and we're going to pull it out as a factor. So I'm actually going to walk through this whole problem. So the first thing we want to do is take out the negative. So if I factor out a negative, what does that do? Well, it just basically changes all of the signs. So if I pull out a negative, we're just going to have all of our signs change like this. So we have negative parentheses 5x squared plus 8x minus 4. And now we're going to take what we have on the inside here, and we're going to factor that like we would this problem here. So we're going to factor this by grouping. So we're going to go ahead and take the leading coefficient and our constant term and multiply them. So 5 times negative 4 is negative 20. And then we have an 8 here on the bottom. Now, our back term is negative. So that tells me we're going to have 1 positive, 1 negative. So we're going to have 1 positive, 1 negative. And we're looking for numbers that multiply to be -20 and add to 8. So let's take a look at that. So factors of 20 that add, or -20 that add to 8. So we have 1 and 20, 2 and 10, no 3, 4 and 5. Since our middle term is positive, that means the bigger number is going to be positive. So these will be our negative values. And then what would they be? So -2 and 10 sum to 8. So we have a positive 10 and a -2. So let's go ahead and factor this here by grouping. Shoot. There we go. Man, can't seem to catch a break. Okay, so factoring by grouping. So technically, I'm going to move this out of the way here. So technically, we have this negative out in front. So it's going to be negative, and then we're going to have 5x squared. We're still going to rewrite this middle term, right? We're still rewriting this middle term as 10x minus 2x and then minus 4. Let me get rid of these. And then we're going to split and factor. So when splitting, we're going to get from these two, we're going to get out a 5 and an x, and then 5x times x is 5x squared. 5 times a positive 2 is 10. Now our leading coefficient is negative, so we're going to take down a negative here. And from these two terms, we're going to pull out a 2. -2 times positive x is -2x. -2 times a positive 2 is -4. So you see that these two are the same. Now, we can't forget about this negative here. So really, on the outside of all of this, we have a negative. Now, with those x plus 2's being the same, that's our first group. And then what we had on the outside is our next group. And this negative stays on the outside. So that would be how you would approach a problem like this. And these are some of those helpful hints and tips that I wanted to give you on this. So again, remember, if you have a leading coefficient of 1, you can actually jump straight to your two groups. If your back term is positive, then that means that your two signs in your group are going to be the same, and they're determined by your middle sign. If your back term is negative, then you'll have one positive and one negative. And that also is true when your leading coefficient is not 1, right? So you can see in this situation, back sign is negative, and we end up with a positive and a negative.